One, welcome to the webinar Cambodia as ASEAN Chair, Prospects for Human Rights in 2022. This is organized by the Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development and CIVICUS, World Alliance for Citizen Participation. I'm Gianna Catolico, ASEAN Fellow for FORUM-ASIA, and I will be your moderator for this webinar. In conjunction with the much anticipated turnover of the ASEAN Chairpersonship and the conclusion of the 38th and 39th ASEAN Summit, FORUM-ASIA and CIVICUS conceptualized this webinar with three clear objectives. The first one is provide a brief CSO assessment of Brunei's performance as ASEAN Chair this 2021, especially in addressing the Myanmar crisis, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association, and other human rights issues. Second objective, deliver a forecast on Cambodia's position on the most pressing regional and domestic issues as next year's ASEAN Chair on issues related to the field of human rights, democratization, and both in regional and domestic levels, and including the Myanmar crisis as well. And the last objective is to enumerate recommendations to ASEAN CSOs and relevant stakeholders to effectively engage with Cambodia and lobby with ASEAN and its sectoral bodies to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights in accordance with international and regional human rights standards. We hope that through this webinar, we can provide you with a CSO outlook of Cambodia's priority issues and standpoint on human rights issues as ASEAN Chair next year. Before we introduce the speakers, we kindly request everyone to write down your name, organization or affiliation, and country of residence in our Zoom chat box, and please set it as your meeting name for this webinar. Please take note that this webinar is being live streamed on FORUM-ASIA's Facebook page, so please feel free to share the live stream in your respective social media channels or networks. And for each speaker will have 10 minutes to deliver their speech. And for speakers, again, exactly 9 minutes after your speech. I may have to politely and kindly interrupt you and inform you that you only have 1 minute left, and thus you need to wrap up your speech. We apologize for this, and we need to keep up with the 10-minute time duration per speaker. And for participants, please mute your microphone throughout the webinar. If you wish to ask a question to speakers later in the Q&A session, please type your questions using the Q&A feature, and I will read it later. And most importantly, last but not the least, please make sure your questions are concise and cohesive as much as possible. And now, without further ado, let us move to the first speaker. Our first speaker is Ms. Khin Ohmar. She is the founder of Progressive Voice, a participatory Myanmar rights-based policy research and advocacy group. Khin Ohmar has been a human rights practitioner and advocate since the 8888 uprising in 1988. She studied at Bard's College at Simon's Rock in the United States and worked with Refugees International. Dear attendees, let us all give a virtual round of applause to Khin Ohmar. Ms. Khin Ohmar, the floor is now yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Gianna. Thanks to everyone, all of you who are joining us today, as we fast approaching to end 2021, which is the most turbulent, most violent, and most restless year for the people of Myanmar. This webinar is quite timely for us to discuss, especially on the issue of Cambodia taking up the chairmanship of ASEAN next year. Because now the whole world is placing ASEAN at the forefront, looking up to the ASEAN to address the crisis in Myanmar. So thanks to CIVICUS and FORUM-ASIA for organizing this, and thanks all for joining. So in the past 10 months since the Myanmar military attempted this brutal, bloody coup, and also 7 months since the ASEAN 5-point consensus was adopted, I think we all know very well the ASEAN has failed to take any meaningful actions to mitigate the crisis in Myanmar. Actually, I would say that the 5-point consensus was actually the beginning of the 5-point consensus was already a failure. I already predicted since then is because those 5-point consensus were not it didn't involve the people of Myanmar, the very primary stakeholder of our country. No civil society were involved, and especially, particularly, of course, this is the leader's decision. So in that case, the very legitimate government of Myanmar, the Myanmar people, the National Unity Government, was not involved. The ASEAN actually didn't include the National Unity Government. So I think that was the very beginning. It was already, the 5-point was already starting with that major flaw. And also it was agreed only by the Myanmar military junta's leader, and he didn't honor his words. He didn't honor his pledge. And now look where we are. And not only that he didn't honor, the junta has repeatedly ignored and even openly defiant against the 5 points. So these 5 points also include 1 point, which is to appoint the special envoy. Of course, the special envoy from Brunei, the second Minister of Foreign Affairs. And he was appointed in August. And we all see that he has not been able to do anything meaningful or bring any meaningful impact to the ground for the people. So while we welcome the unprecedented decision by the ASEAN of excluding the military leader May Online from the ASEAN Summit in October, and also again in the ASEAN-China Special Summit in November. Yes, it is unprecedented and we really welcome it, but there are no other substantive actions have been taken since. The actions that are desperately needed by the people of Myanmar, because the whole country is now engaged in civil war, because this Myanmar military has actually launched the all-out war terror campaign against the people. We need the ASEAN leaders to realize that ASEAN alone is also not equipped to bring solution to this multi-layer crisis that Myanmar is facing. And this crisis cannot wait any longer either. So this crisis requires a full-fledged international response, and we need the UN to actually join the ASEAN in the coordinated effort at the front line. And I think this is something that we've been calling for. So as we transition over to Cambodia as the chair of the ASEAN, we really need to continue to hold the ASEAN and special envoy to account for their actions and also the inactions. The ASEAN must meet with the National Unity Government to hear from the legitimate representative of the people of Myanmar. And I call on the special envoy at least to show us that he is with the people of Myanmar before he moves on from this mandate. First step will be for him to hold consultation officially with the National Unity Government. Time is not on our side, my friends. The more time that passes, the more suffering of our people on the ground. The ASEAN needs, as the ASEAN stagnates, we have to understand this junta is further emboldened, and that's something that we really need to stop. That they are violence, because as of 30th of November, they killed 1,300 people already in cold blood. More than 10,500, 600 people are already being arrested, you see. So for now, more than 7,500 people remain in detention, and also they are subjected to torture. So we have to also look at how violence intensifies in many different parts of the country, because the military actually advancing with their military operations to attack especially in the ethnic areas or the areas where the people's defiance against them is very strong and bold. So this is something that we need to really stop it. So the people of Myanmar are going through hell, but we have to also embrace how strong Myanmar people are in their continuing defiance against this junta to bring their democracy back. Women are at the forefront. Like you see them. I mean, even look at the photo in my visual background. Like this is just like 2-3 days ago. There is no one day that people stop doing their demonstrations on the street. They are like every day peaceful protests are on the street. So we really need the world to act before things get too late. And I would just say, like, there is also the military violence has come to be further intensified and recurrent, to the point of, like, the sexual violence has come to be again another, the militaries, like usual use as a rape as a weapon of war has come back to be also in practice. So we really need to address these issues as well. Humanitarian crisis is deepening, with over 250,000 people now, 250,000 people being also displaced. Yeah. So just in closing, I want to say that the Cambodia, as a next chair of the ASEAN, has a huge task ahead to ensure that the ASEAN's unity and also its credibility in the world's face is not lost under its leadership, under its chairmanship. If this military junta continues to ignore the 5-point consensus and carry on with business as usual, doing all of this violence that ASEAN cannot stop, and then if the ASEAN and the Cambodian chairmanship is to continue to, or like to take the military junta as if this is the government of Myanmar, that is going to go nowhere. In fact, it is going to create more problems. It is in the best interest of the ASEAN, it is in the best interest of Cambodia to actually work with the national unity government, and thus in that way working with the whole people of Myanmar to resolve the country's problems. So I think this is very important point that I want to raise. But also, I mean, the UN General Assembly already adopted the 5-point consensus as well in their resolution, right? So basically, what we really need to see is that UN's Security Council also look into the 5 points as a solution, meaning that the China is also behind these 5 points. But then there are some of us are concerned, like knowing how Cambodian government is so close to China, we want to make sure that Cambodian government will not allow the China influence over the ASEAN agenda or the ASEAN 5 points or the ASEAN's unprecedented decision to not allow or reject May Aung Hlaing, the leader of the military coup from the attempted coup from attending the ASEAN Summit. It's important. So I really need to address that. So the last point that I want to say is the solution to the crisis in Myanmar, it is not only internal, it is not only regional also, it is a global. The ASEAN alone is not equipped to deal with this crisis. And also that we have seen this in the last 10 months already. So we need the ASEAN to actually bring in the international actors, especially the United Nations, to really work together with the national unity government and the civil society organizations. And then I want to call on my last point. I want to call on our friends in Cambodia. First of all, thank you so much for your unwavering solidarity that you have lended to the people of Myanmar, not only in the past 10 months, but also in the past under the previous military regime time. You continue to stand with us. And this is something that we really value. And we know that you will continue to stand with us along the way. So in the next 2022, as we will bring our voices from the ground to your governments, to hear, for the Cambodian government to hear our voices, we hope that you will be the door for us, you will be the bridge for us, and you will be with us along this way. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Khin Ohmar, for your informative speech. Through Khin Ohmar's speech, we learned that the 5-point consensus adopted by ASEAN last April has not been fully implemented, and the delays in its implementation caused more suffering to the people of Myanmar and those on the ground. This poses as a challenge for Cambodia as it begins its chairpersonship next year. Without further ado, let me call on the next speaker, who can also shed light regarding NUG's stance on the ASEAN's recklessness and ineffectiveness in dealing with the Myanmar crisis. The next speaker is Yu Bo Htint. Apologies if I did not pronounce your name correctly. He was recently appointed as the National Unity Government's ambassador to ASEAN. This is just recently. Mr. Bo Htint was the former foreign minister of the National Coalition Government of the Union of Burma, and he was also imprisoned during the 888 uprising and was later elected as a member of the parliament in 1990. And he is also one of the most notable figures in NUG, especially now that we are now in a Myanmar crisis and we need ASEAN's responsibility in this. And without further ado, dear attendees, let us all give a virtual round of applause to Yubo Latin. I hope I pronounced your name correctly, and apologies if I did not pronounce it well. The floor is now yours, and you have 10 minutes to deliver your speech.
Thank you, Gianna, and FORUM-ASIA and CIVICUS for making this crucial event for our country and allowing me to join this event. So today marks 10 months after the February 1st attempted but failed military coup in Myanmar. In other words, it has been 10 months since the military general in Myanmar trying to stop the democratic freedom and gaining momentum of the democratization process under the leadership of a democratically elected civilian government between 2015 and 2020 under the leadership of Aung San Suu Kyi. So overwhelming happiness and higher expectation of Myanmar people to be into a more open and secure society, along with the landslide victory of the NLD in 2020 November general elections, were suddenly destroying and changed into anger. Actually, the military generals in the name of the State Administrative Council, SAC, I'm not talking about SACM, we are talking about the State Administrative Council as the source of the three major crises in Myanmar today: political, human rights, and humanitarian crisis, or catastrophic situation in our country today. Blatant and direct challenge to the integrity and credibility of the ASEAN as an only regional association. From our view, the ASEAN was not able to make immediate and strong response to the attempted coup, except some individual members expressed their sympathy to the struggle of our people and disappointment toward the unsuccessful military coup. Being in a wait-and-see mode almost for 3 months. In late April, as you mentioned before, the ASEAN invited Senior General Min Aung Hlaing to a special session of leadership and able to produce a 5-point consensus, which became the only agenda up to now. I intentionally use only agenda because this is the way that the thing the ASEAN want to do concerning the crisis in Myanmar, but no strategic action plan with timeline and articulation how to achieve it. So it is not a strategic action plan, but also the only agenda how and ASEAN leadership would like to do in Burma, so that we want the ASEAN leadership to have a strategic vision, strategic action plan, rather than only agenda as a, to be here by the other and supported by other. So that since Ohmar already articulate everything, completely, I have nothing else a lot to say much about that, but in accordance with the 5-point consensus, especially, and why was appointed and trying his best to convince the military to cooperate with him or ASEAN, but it was blatantly denied by the military or failure to cooperate with the ASEAN. So it is pushing the ASEAN Foreign Ministry meeting in October to decide that unprecedented action, denying the General Min Aung Hlaing to be part of the ASEAN Leadership Summit. We fully welcome and encouraged about unprecedented and non-traditional action taken by the ASEAN. But at the same time, we want the firm stand and again, the rejection of the ASEAN individual members as far as such as Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and even Brunei, there's consistent rejection against the participation of Myanmar at the recently hosted by China ASEAN Leadership Summit again. So we are very encouraged and we see some consistency and firm step taken by the ASEAN leadership. But as Ohmar mentioned, ASEAN 5-point consensus has been, totally rejected. And if you look at the last 10 months, all these ASEAN 5-point mentioned to stop the violence, military escalating, military furthermore using excessive military power, targeting civilian, now even women and children are at very severe risks of their life. So the military now, what military now doing is that targeting civilian society as a hostage, as well as their target. And unchecked, if we allow unchecked the dire situation in our country, another genocidal war will be happen in the near future. I can assure you. That is what is really going on, and we are not blaming ASEAN. This is our cause, but at the same time, only regional association must have the strategic thinking and where they are stand for now. What I'm trying to say is that ASEAN already see that their 5-point plan will not be able to implement them alone. So we always calling for and suggesting that ASEAN, even delivery of effective the humanitarian assistance, they cannot do it alone because everybody know that AHA is not ready for the conflict in Burma because of the military itself is source of the conflict. All these crises, the root of cause is military trying to take over the power. So that what we are trying to call the ASEAN is when the international community, including dialogue partner, UN General Assembly or UN Security Council, ASEAN 5-point, ASEAN is the most reasonable regional association to take as a lead to resolve the crisis in Myanmar. So we want ASEAN to take firm stand and be strategic and ready to ask for the dialogue partner and UN to work with them. For example, even particular effective humanitarian assistance and delivery system, we want TRIGA, not only ASEAN, ASEAN plus, dialogue partner plus the UN agency. So in that way, the military junta in Burma will be more difficult to resist. So as Ohmar mentioned, this is not only crisis in Myanmar, this is a great challenge to the credibility and integrity of ASEAN leadership. And it is threat to the regional stability and security. So that we want ASEAN leadership to be more assertive and to be more strategic, not only just talking about 5-point and when failure of military to cooperate, they have nothing else to say or to do. That is very difficult for Burmese people to expect. The ASEAN will become the only regional association that will be secure all kinds of challenges, not only Burmese people today facing, but also in the future. The whole ASEAN society need a leadership who see the real problem is and who dare to speak up and to work out the very democratic way, so that in the name of new chairmanship, we want the Cambodia to listen to the people, because the ASEAN always mentioned they stand with the people of Myanmar. As a representative of people of Myanmar, I would like to spell out that what our people want. Burmese people sacrificing their life today for the last 10 months particularly is they don't want military dictatorship anymore. Secondly, they want genuine democratic federal union. That is only two things they're sacrificing their lives for, and this fighting against the military. So that we want the new chairmanship to seriously listen to our people and work with our people. The National Unity Government appoint me is to show their readiness to work with the ASEAN leadership as well as ASEAN people within the region, so that we are truly believes people to be people, ASEAN people will be in our side. But we ask for the ASEAN leadership to be practical, to be democratic, to be assertive, and to be strategic, to take the leadership role to resolve all the crises in Myanmar. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak like that.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Yubo, for sharing NUG's insights, stances, and viewpoint on ASEAN's performance in dealing with the Myanmar crisis. He's shed the light on the importance of ASEAN in making more strategies and strategizing its plans right now and fully implementing the 5-point consensus towards consensus building and solving the Myanmar crisis efficiently and immediately. And thank you very much. Sorry, I did not address you as ambassador. I'm going to address you as ambassador right now. So thank you very much for your heartwarming speech. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our next speaker from CIVICUS. Our third speaker is Mr. Josef Benedict. He coordinates research on civic space in the Asia-Pacific region and undertakes research papers on civic space with CIVICUS. He was also the deputy, oh, wait a minute. Let me just adjust my screen. He was also the Deputy Director for Campaigns on Southeast Asia and the Pacific for Amnesty International, where he managed the development of strategic and operational plans for the regional office, as well as monitoring the human rights developments in coordination with the management team. Prior to his role, he was also a campaigner in Indonesia and Timor-Leste, and the Executive Director for Amnesty International Malaysia. He holds a master's degree in human rights from the London School of Economics and Political Science and a master's on strategic and defense studies from the University of Malaya. Dear attendees, let us all give a virtual round of applause to Mr. Josef Benedict. Mr. Josef Benedict, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Gianna, and a very good morning to everyone. What I'll do in my presentation is to look back at the broader state of civic space in ASEAN over the last year under Brunei's chairmanship, and then look at prospects for reform under Cambodia and make some broad recommendations. Next, for those of you who may not be aware, CIVICUS is a global civil society alliance with members in 170 countries globally. We work to defend and promote civic space, to strengthen the power of citizen action, and to build an effective and accountable civil society. We developed the CIVICUS Monitor in 2016, an online platform tracking civic space in 196 countries in collaboration with civil society. The monitor also provides information and ratings on the country's civic space. Next. Let me start by stating that there are very clear obligations to respect and protect civic space that includes freedom of expression, assembly, and association, what we know as fundamental freedoms in virtually all countries in ASEAN. These rights are critical for both citizens and civil society to speak up, to organize, and to mobilize in order to influence laws and policies and the political structures around them. These protections are enshrined firstly in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but also in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which 6 ASEAN countries are party to this treaty. There are also freedoms that are enshrined in the ASEAN Declaration of Human Rights, Article 22 and 23, and nearly all ASEAN members have some form of protections in their national constitutions and laws. Further, there are also commitments that have been made by ASEAN states at the Universal Periodic Review at the Human Rights Council, as well as through the SDG process, that is SDG 1610. So very clear obligations within ASEAN to respect and protect civic space. Now, what is the reality for civic space next? In reality, what we see, if you look at this map, is that the state of civic space in ASEAN is pretty bleak. If you look, 2 countries are rated close, Vietnam and Laos. 5 are rated as repressed, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Philippines, and Brunei. And 3 are rated as obstructed, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. In fact, one of these countries will be further downgraded when we launch our new global report next week. So moving on, if you look at Brunei, when Brunei took over as chair in late 2020, it could have, if it wanted to, place some level of prominence on human rights and civic space. However, I think there was very little expectation among civil society of them speaking up about human rights in the region because of its poor record at home. Fundamental freedoms are severely restricted in Brunei, which is an absolute monarchy, and where the Sultan exercises executive power under a long-standing emergency. It restricts freedom of assembly, there are no laws on freedom of association, and virtually no independent civil society. In fact, the Civicus Monitor downgraded the state of civic space in Brunei to repress in December 2019, and there's been no documented progress on improving fundamental freedoms. I think the only reason Brunei decided to engage on the crisis in Myanmar was the pressure from some ASEAN countries and from the international community. But even that, it took more than 2 months for a meeting to be called and more than 3 months for the special envoy to be appointed. Next. Now, what are some of the top violations that we have documented in the region under Brunei's chairmanship? I think firstly, a major worry has been the systematic use of restrictive laws deployed all across the region to silence dissent and prosecute human rights defenders. We have documented both national security and public order laws used to jail activists in countries like Vietnam, where over 200 political prisoners are behind bars, some facing very long sentences. In Cambodia, scores of activists have been charged and detained under incitement laws. And in Myanmar, we saw existing laws being arbitrarily amended by the junta to expand its scope and punishment and use against the activists and protesters as part of the crackdown. We've also seen an increasing use of criminal defamation laws across ASEAN. In Thailand, we've seen an escalation of lèse majesté provisions used as well as sedition against pro-democracy protesters. In Malaysia, the Communications and Multimedia Act has been used to criminalize online criticism of the royalty and politicians, as well as the internet law in Indonesia. And further to add to this, this year, we saw the passage of the draconian Foreign Interference Countermeasures Act in Singapore, which could be used to severely curtail civic freedoms, and efforts in Thailand to push for a restrictive NGO law. Some of the other violations that we have seen is a crackdown on protests in a number of countries in ASEAN. In Myanmar, we have seen the deadly violence used by the junta against the civil disobedience movement, with hundreds arbitrarily detained. But also in Thailand, the police have attempted to disrupt pro-democracy protests, at times using excessive or deadly force. Even in Indonesia, we have seen protests in West Papua against the unilateral renewal of the special autonomy law in August, met with arbitrary arrests. The Civicus Monitor has also documented harassment and intimidation tactics used across ASEAN. In the Philippines, activists and journalists have been vilified and red tagged before being detained, attacked, or killed with impunity. While even here in Malaysia, youth activists criticizing government policies have been hauled up by the police for questioning, harassed at their homes, and fined for breaching COVID-19 laws. There are also serious concerns amidst the pandemic that increased surveillance against activists, as well as digital attacks and hacking. And finally, another violation documented has been the targeting of the media, such as the judicial harassment of journalists, including Maria Ressa, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, and the torture and ill-treatment of activists, particularly in Vietnam and Myanmar. Next, we also documented pandemic-specific violations, including overtly broad restrictive emergency or other laws in numerous countries, including Thailand and Cambodia. In Malaysia, the former Prime Minister imposed a state of emergency for 7 months just to hold on to power. Other concerns include censorship under the guise of dealing with misinformation, protest restrictions, and increased surveillance and restrictions on the right to privacy. And on all these issues, ASEAN has been virtually silent beyond being forced to engage on Myanmar. In 2020, ICHA issued a joint statement to integrate human rights into its pandemic response. However, Brunei has not responded to the various civic space restrictions that I mentioned earlier imposed by ASEAN governments. While AICHA has had some discussions and dialogues that includes elements of civic space, it continues to be a toothless human rights body, and only a few AICHA commissioners have spoken up informally on human rights issues over this period. Next. Now, what about Cambodia, which has just taken over the chairmanship? It is also currently rated repressed by the CIVICUS monitor. And in 2021, we documented arbitrary arrests of dozens of activists, judicial harassment, intimidation of opposition CNRP members and their families, as well as reprisals on journalists. We also saw the passage of a sub-decree establishing a national internet gateway, which will further expand surveillance in the country. Cambodia's Prime Minister Hun Sen has already set the tone for his country's chair by warning that he will do whatever it takes to crack down on dissidents planning any form of protest against his one-party rule. This clearly sets a very regressive trajectory for civic space over the next year. And I think the only difference between Brunei and Cambodia is that there's been greater scrutiny of its record by the UN and states via the Human Rights Council, plus more independent, diverse, and civil society actors within Cambodia. Therefore, from our vantage point, it's really hard to see how Cambodia at the helm of ASEAN would meaningfully progress on human rights and civic space issues. And further, with commune elections coming up in 2022, I foresee Cambodia focusing more on internal repression within its own country rather than on issues happening externally. I would like to now end with a number of recommendations. Next. I think there's a real need to push for ASEAN and its dialogue partners to engage and discuss with civil society the worrying state of civic space in the region. It also needs to keep up and amplify the pressure and momentum on ASEAN to seriously deal with Myanmar and engage with the NUG government, as mentioned earlier. We also need to use Cambodia's ASEAN membership to push for improvements on civic space in the country ahead of elections. We also need to engage with AICHA to explore ways to ensure that human rights principles are mainstream in the efforts by ASEAN to address the situation in Myanmar, as well as other post-pandemic issues. Next. We also need to engage with AICHA to expand its engagement with civil society actors in the region. And it's also important that we as civil society document and monitor the performance of ASEAN under Cambodia's chairmanship and hold them accountable for any violations. There's also a need to push for greater dialogue with civil society, ASEAN and dialogue partners to discuss the human rights situation in the region. And finally, we need to explore more collaborative approaches inside and outside the ASEAN framework amidst the limitations of Cambodia's chairmanship. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Joseph Benedict, for your insightful presentation. We learned about the human rights situation in ASEAN, wherein there's the use of criminal, draconian, and repressive laws that are used to target protesters and opposition leaders in ASEAN. We also learned that the situation in Cambodia has not improved. And in fact, in the CIVICUS monitor, Cambodia was rated repressed because of its surveillance and crackdown on civil society. Without further ado, I'm going to call on our fourth speaker in our webinar. She is Ms. Sopheap Chak, who is the Executive Director of the Cambodian Center for Human Rights. CCHR is one of the leading human rights organizations working for the promotion and protection of civil and political rights in Cambodia. As one of the country's most prominent human rights advocates, Sopheap's work has been recognized by former US President Barack Obama in a forum with world leaders at the Clinton Global Initiative back in 2014. Dear attendees, let us all give a virtual round of applause to Ms. Chak Sopheap. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. So Ms. Chak Sopheap, the floor is now yours and you have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Gina, and my respect to all our speakers here, as well as our audience who are following right now. It's kind of tough morning to hear all the, not a positive development, but concerning development within the ASEAN regions. While we all have been hit by, a series of civic space crackdown, as well as the common issue that the global have been facing right now is the COVID pandemic. I can feel the most difficult time for Myanmar friends, as Khin Ohmar had pointed out, it is very extreme, challenging time for the people over there. It's not just the COVID pandemic, but it's a bloody military coup that have been staged even before the rise of the pandemic that we are experiencing. So I can feel how difficult for the people over there, and I can share that we all with all of you, and we will do our best. But like hearing a lot of statement, I feel like Cambodia have to do a lot, and I feel so heavy from the side of civil society organization. But I cannot imagine how pressing time for the state, I mean for Cambodian government to think strategically and to respond to the call from the people of the ASEAN, especially the Myanmar people. So here, if you look at Cambodia previous chairmanship in 2012, it was a controversial time, and because back then ASEAN failed to issue a joint statement for the first time in 45-year history, because Cambodia blocked criticism of China aggression in the South China Sea. Cambodia relations to China, I think to many of you have known, have become stronger since then, that have posed many questions for Cambodia impartiality. Despite this past controversy, Cambodia can still somehow, lead the ASEAN through its most pressing issue in 2022. A core pillar of ASEAN is to put the bloc countries' interests before foreign powers, and this should prioritize in the Cambodia chairmanship. Looking at the situation in Myanmar, my take is that the situation have been escalating in the country, and the country is on the brinks of the civil war between the Tamil and the ethnic minorities. Urgent action is really needed, and I totally agree with the ambassador and Khin Ohmar point of view. We need to think strategically and come with the real action plan, not just the agenda to present, for the sake of doing something. But urgent action is needed to immediately stop crime against humanity and grave human rights abuse for occurring. Cambodia have thus far not taken any strong stand, unfortunately, toward the military coup and subsequent events, citing the principle of non-interference in the ASEAN Charter. However, Cambodia recently announced plan to set up an ad hoc task force to work with Myanmar conflict party quietly through the backdoor diplomacy. We all know in April, ASEAN produced a 5-point consensus on Myanmar, like our friend have shared, which regrettably fell short on the condemning the event in Myanmar since the military coup in February 2021. And in the mid of October, ASEAN agreed to bar Myanmar military chief from attending ASEAN meeting. Indeed, he was invited to the meeting in April 2021, and instead inviting a high-ranking veteran diplomat as a non-political representative. This was somehow allegedly a rare move by the ASEAN, and we want to see more real action. Coming to the another issue on the COVID-19, across the Southeast Asia, human rights and fundamental freedom have been significantly curtailed in the name of the curbing the spread of COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic have exacerbated inequality and social division across the region. In 2022, ASEAN is primarily focused on the economic recovery from the impact of the pandemic, such such economic approach must ensure that the most vulnerable and hard impacted community across the region are prioritized in the recovery and not just the lucrative private interests. I would now just point out the linkage of the coming election in Cambodia to the ASEAN leadership. So as you may follow, Cambodia will have coming commune council election next year, and the following year is in 2023 is a national election. So we all know somehow, regardless the challenging ASEAN is, but within the region, we say that promoting the rule of law and the robust civil society is central to the ASEAN objective. Ensuring that Cambodian upcoming commune election are fair and free from the undue influence, violence, and intimidation is imperative. Historically, Cambodia have a dark history of suppression of voters and the political opposition, resulting in the international condemnation. In light of the political and human rights landscape in Cambodia, the dissolution of the main opposition party in 2017 and the events that have happening in the past few years does remain as to whether the election will adhere to the democratic principle. So 2022 commune election will also set the stage for the national election in 2023. I want to cite a few examples of the difficulty of political landscape and election in Cambodia. So as you may follow in this few weeks, there have been a deportation of a few former opposition members from Thailand. Just yesterday and today, we watched the news of another deportation of a monk, from Thailand as well. And this was done at the request of Cambodian authority, and their immediate arrest and imprisonment upon the arrival in Cambodia. The recently slain former CNRP activist, the Cambodian National Review Party that had been dissolved. So this slain case, require a prompt independent and impartial investigation into the death, and the suspicious circumstance of obstruction to some new political party in terms of their registration or the way that they can hang their banner on the street. It also challenging. And another example is the mass trial over 100 of former opposition party, whom some of whom have been sentenced already to 20 to 25 years imprisonment, with many other still standing trials throughout the year, and undoubtedly in the coming 2022. So additionally, those convicted have been stripped of their rights to participate in politics again. Well, the credibility of ASEAN, of Cambodia as an ASEAN chair in the coming year will depend on how the Commune Council unfold. If there is a voter suppression, intimidation, or violence, Cambodia, and as a result, ASEAN will lose its legitimacy in dealing with the issue pertaining to the democratic process and human rights across the bloc. So, in terms of recommendation, what's next for ASEAN, especially for Cambodia as a chair? Too often the ASEAN use the principle of non-interference to turn the blind eye to the grave human rights violation or atrocity happening in the member states, like the case of Myanmar. So this year, under Cambodia chairmanship, ASEAN should take a swift and strong action to better enhance the bloc and promote the human rights center approach to the governance. First and foremost, Cambodia's role as a chair should be categorized around the taking concrete steps to ease the violation situation in Myanmar. And I totally agree with the voice from our friend here earlier, point out that the need of the Myanmar people is no military dictatorship, and they want a democratic unity, and this is the need of Myanmar people. And often the ASEAN always say that they listen to the people of ASEAN. So now the voice of the Myanmar people voice out, and we need to listen to them. And also, concerning to the 5 points.
Sophia,
Yes,
I'm really sorry to interrupt. You have 1 minute left.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so concerning to the 5-point plan endorsed by the ASEAN, the chair had to start with a strong term, condemnation of the military regime, and also make sure that the envoy can start the process of facilitation and listen to the voice of the people. And yeah, I mean, setting the example by respecting the human right in its own country, especially ensuring the free and fair election in the coming year, is a set example as a chair toward other member states. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Chak Sophia, for your wonderful speech, and apologies for interrupting you earlier. We learned, and perhaps Chak Sophia reminded us, that Cambodia's previous chairpersonship was controversial because they did not issue a joint statement for ASEAN, which was the first in the almost 4-decade history of the regional bloc. And of course, Cambodia's commune elections, and also the forced and inhumane deportation of Khmer refugees from Thailand, serves as a greater challenge for Cambodia to improve its human rights record, given that they will be the ASEAN chair next year. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our last speaker for this webinar. Our last speaker for this webinar is Arinii Judhistari. She is currently the Director of Policy at WikiMedia, and everybody knows her because she's our previous East Asia and ASEAN Program Manager. Well, prior to that, she joined ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights as a program manager, where she worked with parliamentarians to promote human rights issues in ASEAN. She has previously worked with the Asian Pacific Research and Resource Center for Women, or ARO, and for many contributions in the region. She was appointed as a Frida Young Feminist Fund Advisor for 4 years and ARO board member from 2015 up to present time. Dear attendees, let us all give a virtual round of applause to Arinii Judhistari. Kak Rachel, the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Gianna, and warm welcome to everyone. As a beginning, I would like to resonate my appreciations and also alignment with the previous presentations by other speakers. And for the interest of time, I will try to provide 3 broad recommendations for Cambodia as 2022 ASEAN Chair, especially in regards to the digital realm. So as introductions, the Wikimedia Foundations definitely welcomes the opportunity to speak in this webinar. So thank you FORUM-ASIA and CIVICUS for organizing this important event. And for some of you who doesn't know about Wikimedia Foundations, the foundation is actually the nonprofit that hosts and promotes Wikipedia and other related projects. We protect the values and policies that allows free knowledge to thrive. And in November 2021 alone, Wikimedia projects such as Wikipedia were viewed by 746 million times by users in ASEAN countries. All of the knowledge and information on Wikipedia is written and edited by the community, people who volunteer their time to contribute to free knowledge. And that community plays a decisive role in our project to facilitate knowledge sharing. To empower them in doing so, we offer 3 recommendations to the Cambodia, taking note on the presentations from colleagues from CIVICUS, CCHR, and UG, as well as Progressive Voice. The 3 recommendations are preserving digital inclusions and ensure the provisions of unrestricted internet access in all countries within ASEAN. The second recommendation is to promote open platforms and community self-governance. And the third recommendation is participation in knowledge, especially in the context of post-pandemic recovery framework, which safeguard internet users on privacy and protections against surveillance, safety, and freedom of expressions. So I will go deeply into the first recommendations. Our first recommendations, as I mentioned earlier, is to preserve digital inclusions and ensure the provision of unrestricted internet access is available in all countries within ASEAN. As we know, digital society, democracy, and civic space are under attack around the world, including in ASEAN. But only if we ensure that everyone can participate online can we promote inclusions and human rights for all of us. A supportive legal environment is needed to protect the rights of people to build communities online, to participate online, and to also have participations, to also have civic participations online. Therefore, it is essential for the upcoming ASEAN Chair, Cambodia, and dialogue partners to engage with key stakeholders, including the civil society, legitimate governments like NUG that join us today, and community platforms by inviting them to the 2022 summits and other relevant decision-making process of ASEAN. And now, more than ever, the ASEAN Chair should retain priority on digitalizations as an area within ASEAN discussions. However, digitalizations can mean many things. For instance, it means allowing people to come online and use the internet to engage with others. Therefore, the ASEAN Chair needs to work towards protecting and restoring internet access in all countries within ASEAN. And these include in conflict and crisis situations, such as to what is happening in Myanmar right now. Censorship of speech, including blanket internet shutdowns, runs counter to WikiMedia's missions and deteriorates regional instability in ASEAN. Internet is where millions of people turn for access to information and resources. And the Wikimedia project are an important piece of that. Blocking the internet for a certain populations is a huge loss of knowledge in the world, and it prevents the people who suffer from disruption of connectivity from participations in culture, education, and science along with the rest of the world. Second recommendation is to promote open platforms and community self-governance. Digitalizations also encompass ensuring that people can use open channels to communicate safely. And these also include for Myanmar and Cambodian friends that are joining us today. The chair, Cambodia, should promote thoughtful policy for internet platforms through which much of today's communications and expressions take place. Governments must avoid prescriptive requirement on content moderations in context of intermediary liability that are tailored around big tech platforms or short deadlines that would require or or encourage automatic content filtering, because this might lead to over removal, as we've seen in the case of social activism and dissenting content, as well as documentations of human rights violations. When automated processes are used heavily to detect and remove content online, the consequences is often the over removal or entirely legal legitimate content. And the third recommendation is actually on participations in knowledge, especially in the context of the post-pandemic recovery framework. Sopheap of CCHR has mentioned how the COVID-19 pandemic has been utilized as a excuses for government to pose a stricter regulations that affecting freedom of expressions and assembly. We also resonate with that because we all deserve a better and safer internet. Therefore, we specifically call Cambodia as the 2022 ASEAN Chair to encourage lawmakers to work with collaborators across sectors, including civil society organizations and us, to develop policies that empower citizens to improve internet together. More than ever, all of us need to think carefully about how new rules will foster, not hinder, online environment that allows for new forms of culture, science, and participation of knowledge. Lawmakers can engage with public interest communities such as ours to develop standards and principles that are more inclusive, practical, and effective. And again, as COVID-19 spread rapidly across the world, people everywhere were hungry for reliable information, especially through online platform. The 2022 chair priority should continue the support of post-pandemic recovery framework, especially on the agenda of protecting human rights in the digital age, which we can see in the strategy 4 of ASEAN post-pandemic recovery framework on accelerating inclusive digital transformations. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier, in order to encompass all of the recommendations, the Cambodian chair should ensure safeguards for internet users so that their privacy can be protected, especially against state surveillance, and their freedom of expressions can be exercised. So I will end my point there, and I'm happy to interact more in the discussions forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for sharing a wonderful and insightful speech. Rachel elucidated about the state of internet freedom and knowledge sharing in Southeast Asia. And ASEAN should promote an inclusive and human rights-based policy for all internet platforms and allow civil society to exercise free speech on the internet. And without further ado, since all of the speakers have already delivered their respective speeches, we can now move on to our next part of the webinar, the question and answer portion. So for participants, if you wish to ask a question to any of the speakers, please submit your questions using the Q&A function located here beside the share screen button. And please make your questions concise and cohesive as much as possible. So in the meantime, I'm checking my chat box and our Q&A function, and I have received 2 questions from the floor. So I'm going to read out the first question from Fatima. Her question is, how to put pressure to ASEAN at least to invite NUG instead of the military junta to the regional meeting or any ASEAN Summit or ASEAN event? I think this question can be best answered by Khin Ohmar and Ambassador Yubo. So perhaps Khin Ohmar, would you like to take this question?
I think I will give the ambassador floor first, then I will follow. Yes, Ambassador Yubo,
sure.
Please. Thank you.
Well,
Thanks,
this is
Gianna.
a very good question. How to pressure is that, that you all, the people power is very imperative. All these civil organizations, not only individual action, but also, all the coordinated effort, sending the strong message through the media, social media, or kind of this webinars, or all level of civil society voice should be strong, because even in the ASEAN principle, constitutional governance or good governance or human rights value or democratic values, such and such, they already mentioned, though, as the people of ASEAN in other countries. Not only, as we learned today, that not only Myanmar people are facing the challenge, but also other countries like in Cambodia and other parts of ASEAN also facing the so-called challenges, so that we want people to be united as a one voice. And then in combination effort, letter writing campaign through the social media or kind of webinar or conferences, or kind of collective effort to let the ASEAN leadership know that what the people of Myanmar want and see. They elected, they supported strongly to the National Unity Government as a legitimate government of the Union of Myanmar, so that if they stand with the people of Myanmar, the way they only have to deal is with the National Unity Government rather than the military junta, who insulting or challenging the integrity and credibility of the ASEAN leadership and causing the regional instability and security risks of the society in the country or in the ASEAN region. So that is, I think Ohmar can fill it up the rest. I should
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Ubo. Following the ambassador's comments, what I see is that if you look back the past 10 months, even though there were slow responses, the ASEAN leadership more or less heard our voices. So like Ubo is saying, the people's voices is so important. I think the ASEAN leaders, regardless of their political status at this point, and they know well, I'm sure they know well that, you know, without people, there is no state. That without people, there is no country. So now the people of Myanmar, in combined voices in solidarity from the people across the region, are telling them what they should be doing. When, together with the FORUM-ASIA, CIVICUS, Progressive Voice, you know, many hundreds of others, CSO counterparts, we have already raised our voice to the ASEAN leadership, what they should be doing. And like, you know, this April 24th meeting, for example, it was 3 months after the military's bloody coup attempt. And yet, still, you know, our voices, we felt like our voices were responded to some extent, but also there's still a lot of hesitancy from the ASEAN leadership. And I think that is where we need to have a breakthrough. We need, again, another round of voices as the Cambodia will take the chairmanship soon. From this forum, I would like to call on your round of solidarity, another round of solidarity again. We'll come to you very soon with our collective voice letter to send from our people, ASEAN people, ASEAN People's Forum and ASEAN Civil Society Conference. We sent our voices again, not long ago, a few months ago. But I think this is, again, time has come for us to raise another round of our collective voice to the ASEAN and to the new chair Cambodian government. So I would like for you to also stand by. What I want to say is that, as I was saying, I think there is a place for the ASEAN leadership to come to, you know, like come to the term that in order to address the Myanmar crisis, it is not through the junta. The whole ASEAN leadership, Cambodia, as well as China, need to understand that the way to stability and economic development and peace in Myanmar and to stop the spillover effects to the region is not through the junta, but to work with the people's elected government, the national unity government. And they have to engage with the NUG. Now, I know they've been reluctant, hesitant, but there were also, like, we just learned from Sophie about the this task force, for example. Yes, we saw ASEAN has taken some unprecedented steps, like including the decision not to allow the coup leader to attend, the military attempted coup leader to attend, right, the summit. But I think just the next step is to engage with the national unity government. And guess what? This is just one of the point of the very 5-point consensus. We're not asking anything new. It is just their own pledge. It is just their own pledge for the ASEAN to engage with all the actors or all the parties of concern, right? So that is going to be the first step for them to have come to their political decision clearly. And how can they start? I think that, they can even start from the very small step, is talk to the national unity government about how to deliver the humanitarian aid and COVID assistance. Yeah, because if you think about the ASEAN sending, I don't remember their total amount. Is it 10 million or 11 million COVID assistance to the junta? Well, it further emboldened the military to carry on while they are disregarding the 5 points boldly, right? So this is exactly how the ASEAN is treated by this junta, total disregard. So now the ASEAN has to start working with the NUG even starting with the COVID, which is in interest of all of us, everybody, the whole world. So I think start with the COVID, start with the humanitarian aid, and work with the NUG from that scratch. I think, you know, like, I mean, NUG is the most viable partnership for them, not only for now to resolve the crisis, but also for the, you know, for the future long like to have this more healthy, longer relationship for Myanmar to be an equal partner, responsible partner of the region. I think that's where we have to push again to the ASEAN leaders to really hear this is the solution, that they must actually make the political decision. So for that, please stand by. We'll come to you with another round of action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Khin Ohmar and Ambassador Yubo, for sharing your answers to the first question. I'm going to move to the second question, which is in the Q&A portion. This question is from someone who wishes to remain anonymous. What can be a concrete way to motivate the Cambodian government to move in the right direction and, you know, perhaps to safeguard human rights principles in Cambodia and ASEAN? I think this question can be best answered by Chak Sopheap. So perhaps Chak Sopheap, feel free to answer this question.
Thank you, Gianna, and thank you to audience who posed this question. I think it's important for us to look at the concrete way, and of course, you know, if that have been spelled out, probably we don't see the human rights abuse not just in Cambodia but in the region. But I think many concrete actions have been sent out through different mechanisms, either, you know, with our civil society organization statements, or, you know, with the UPR recommendation, or even, you know, through the special rapporteur of the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation on Cambodia. You know, his report is also outlined some way that the government should address the human rights abuse. But the issue lie within the government themselves. You know, like if you look at the Myanmar, you know, now the power is with military. So what should we do? Are we going to engage, or are we going to, you know, like leave the solution working with the military? You know, that would not resulting in a positive way. That's why our friends suggesting that, you know, the way forward is to work with the people, not with the military. But, you know, come to the question of Cambodia, I think it really requires the continuing and resilient participation from civil society like us. We should not stop or give up because of what have been happening. I know that in the past few years, it have been tough for us, especially for civil society organization, human rights defender have been under massive crackdown. But I think the good news is that for me, I always think more optimistic that, you know, on the other side of coin of this repression is the fact that we see people are fighting, people are advocating for the right respect. That's why there are class with the power, you know. So continuing from the public to participate, to demand, to hold the government accountable is important. If we don't speak up, if we just stop, I think it will let everything continue. So people participation is the key. But second, when it comes to the ASEAN, we talking in the context of the ASEAN, I think it requires the other ASEAN member, you know, to take step as well. I believe that many ASEAN leader would not want to see the region would be, you know, jeopardized by the political polarization. So they would have certain motive to do something and ensure the kind of balance within the region. You know, not in the mid of the between the superpower like China or US. So it's really important to maintain this neutrality. Secondly is the other international community. I know when engaging with the ASEAN, there are other international actors want to engage, like the UK, they have requests to become the ASEAN dialogue partner, or other country, So this international community have a role to play too, to ensure that any trade or bilateral or multilateral partnership is contingent to human rights respect. I think there are examples of some, like European country, they have a EBA scam or other, action that targeted action that can hold somehow the government to change its direction. So I encourage to international community to see their leverage in a way that they Cambodia or any other country, not just Cambodia, but in the case of Myanmar, how this international community have a role to play, because of course ASEAN is a key player to address this matter, but when we all know we should not expect too much, we have to be realist. So other international community have the role to play to pressure the ASEAN, to pressure individual country to ensure the respect. So I don't have, I may not give you exact answer, but that is the way forward. I think we have to continue our demand to hold individual country accountable. Thank you.
Sure, that's a really great and a promising answer. Thank you very much, Chak, Sophia, for answering the second question. And I'm going to move to the third question that perhaps Rachel and Joseph can best answer. So it's from another participant who wishes to remain anonymous. How can internet freedom counter fake news that challenges legitimate information, especially on social media, without putting human rights defenders at risk? So perhaps, Joseph, would you like to start, followed by Rachel? Thank you.
Sure, yeah. So I think it's crucial to understand that a lot of the freedoms that we are pushing for at the in kind of in the kind of physical real life also applies to the internet. I think, and we need to recognize that that's very important, that these protections are not just in a kind of physical day-to-day operations, but the space that's needed online. And I think for many countries in ASEAN, and we have documented, the easy thing to do is to resort to restricting information, to impose internet shutdowns, to basically go after those who are putting out that information. But this doesn't solve the core issues of fake news that continues to circulate around, And I think more and more countries are recognizing that you need to find alternative means to ensure that information reaches out to the public, especially now during the pandemic. And I think that what other solutions that others have been proposing is to ensure that there's proper fact-checking of information that's going out there, that to ensure that information is flowing out to all sectors of society, because obviously there are certain parts of the country that may not be able to access issues around language and so forth. So the easy thing to do is to restrict, but restricting information we have seen is not the solution. It undermines civic space obligations of various countries, but it also, in fact, actually makes the situation for information even worse for many communities and so forth. So I think fundamentally, in order to deal with fake news, we need to ensure that proper information is reaching out to those we want to target, and to ensure that human rights is respected in that process. I'll end here and pass it on to Rachel.
Thank you, Josef and Gianna. I think in alignment with that, actually, I want to note that censorship of speech, including blanket internet shutdowns, runs counter to our missions. And I think it is evident to see that countries in Southeast Asia are now imposing more restrictive internet regulations, especially on content. And we all see that prescriptive policies on content moderation is not effective, because it's often lead to over removal of content, especially dissenting content, and this also might create chilling effect on self-censorship. And this is something that Cambodia need to address as chair, because with COVID-19, there is a robust progression toward digitalizations in Asia, especially in ASEAN. And therefore, it is very important to ensure that privacy of the users are protected, and not only from the state front, but also how there need to be accountability of for-profit platforms that also manages data. And secondly, the technology of surveillance need to be closely monitored, because surveillance are one of the key things that affecting ability of human rights defenders to work. And in alignment with that, definitely, as Joseph said, community of fact checker is definitely need to be fostered. But looking at like other options that are available is to utilize a decentralized community-based content moderations, like what we do in Wikimedia, so that we don't give like full power of the platform or even states to decide what content that can be included in the digital realm. And we also see how like free speech and we also see how like the fake news might lead to further human rights violations, like with Rohingya genocide. So the ASEAN leaders actually need to act swiftly to address the crisis, and that act should not only focus on offline sphere, but also in digital sphere, because network shutdown and also censorships to website will only further increase the magnitude of crisis that currently felt in Myanmar, and also spill over, and also how that impacting other countries in the region. So I will stop there, and hopefully we can continue the discussions more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel and Joseph, for answering this question. Due to time constraints, we can accommodate the last two questions, and I think we can split the two questions with Ambassador Yubo and Khin Ohmar. So perhaps Ambassador Yubo can take this second to the last question. So this question is from Mo Tuzar. She would like to seek the ambassador's views and recommendations on how the respective special envoys of the United Nations and the ASEAN can consult and coordinate their work on responding with the Myanmar crisis. So Motuzar wants to seek your recommendations and views in how special envoys can lobby with the stakeholders in dealing with the Myanmar crisis. So perhaps Ambassador Yubo, would you like to take this question? You're on mute, Ambassador. Ambassador, can you try speaking again?
Okay, I will try.
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
now
we can hear you
can
now.
you hear me? So
yes.
Thank you for this very important question, Domodusa. I think it is already in the process, not very consistently, but the coordination or cooperation of UN Special Rapporteur and ASEAN Special Rapporteur or Special Envoy, UN Special Envoy and ASEAN Special Envoy is very, it is needed, as well as it is more strategic way to be able to pressure or convince the respective, especially in the Ponta in Myanmar, to not to able to, because of international community should not leave ASEAN alone to tackle the very big challenge, not only in Myanmar, but also this is the great challenge for the region because of its institutional weaknesses, as we all know that. But UN and other dialogue partners now we are working on the kind of Burma Act in United States. After that, we are expecting that United States we appointed kind of not in the name of special envoy, but as a coordinator or kind of the Burma program, so that we want the whole war European Union as well as United States or international key player, not only within the ASEAN and United Nations, all international key player, United Nations and ASEAN combination effort will be very imperative to resolve the crisis in Myanmar as well as in the ASEAN or other parts of the world. I think this is depend upon the mainly depend upon the ASEAN. That is why, because of ASEAN has been put into the centrality role. So ASEAN leadership have the rights and power to demand, because of everybody exactly saying, as you see the recent, a very recent UN Security Council resolution or press release, not resolution, press release also mentioned as 5-point consensus is very important and to be seen as implemented. United States or other international key player from time to time are quite often mentioning the centrality role of the ASEAN. So ASEAN take initiative. As long as ASEAN would like to cooperate with dialogue partner as well as UN, they will be difficult to say no. But my point is that ASEAN special envoy must be proactive. ASEAN leadership as well as special envoy must be proactive, how to strategize to be more effective way of working together, so that if UN will not take initiative, but in principle they have to. But my point is that if ASEAN under these circumstances they have more powerful role or more graceful role to handle this, started to take strategic initiative, talking with the dialogue partner and UN to work together. So creating the kind of tracker mechanism to be more effective. So that I think ASEAN should take lead to that level to be fostered to see that cooperation.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for answering this question. And we have one more question, and perhaps this will be the last for this webinar because we're running out of time. And I think Khin Ohmar is the best person to answer this question. We can only pick one more speaker right now because of time constraints. So this question is from Rosalind Ratana. I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Ms. Rosalind. Is ASEAN's lack of will and actions to tackle the crisis in Myanmar, is it because it is economically profitable for ASEAN countries to engage in trade in Myanmar? Is that why there isn't any sanctions imposed by the rest of the ASEAN countries against Myanmar? So I think her question is mostly directed on the trade sanctions related to oil and gas and among other necessities in Myanmar. So perhaps Khin Ohmar, would you like to answer this question? And just a quick answer would work. Thank you very much.
Sure, I'll try. Thank you. Well, I mean, definitely, yes, because I mean, economic development is one of the major component, right, with the focus. But I think, it has, I mean, right now we can see the individual member states of the ASEAN looking into this matter, like the Vietnam, for example, they are, for example, just to pick one name, is like Viettel, that the Vietnam's military's own enterprise in partnership with the Myanmar military in the telecom operator, for example. There are other things, right? Like the Thailand with the natural gas, and then the Singapore being like, allowing the military's financial flow passing through their country, and there are many of these, yeah. But I think, again, this has to do with what the Ambassador Ubo is saying about the strategic thinking of the ASEAN leadership, how visionary they are, whether it is a short-term visionary or long-term visionary, So if it is a long-term visionary leadership, then they have to see that this trade profits at this moment that they see as their main interest, it will not last unless there is a political stability, right? So in order for them to see Myanmar to get onto the track, to get to their political stability, the only way is for Myanmar to get onto their track of democracy. And then they have to see and understand that Myanmar military is the major stumbling block for Myanmar to move towards democracy. So yeah, I mean, basically, yes, even for the economic benefit, the trade benefit, ASEAN leadership has no choice but to ensure this Myanmar military is placed under the rule of law. That's the only way for them to sustain their long-term economic benefit or economic trade benefit that they might want to envision in working with Myanmar. But very quickly, let me come sorry, no, Gianna, I know you want me to answer only to this question, but I really need to come back to the question from Mamo Duza. Thanks, Mamo, for this question. I would say the new UN Special Envoy being from the region, I think that's a very, it's very positive. It's very positive because, you know, like having the UN Special Envoy from the ASEAN region, as well as also, I mean, the native, I mean, the origin, whereas also having the ASEAN Special Envoy, I think these two envoys really need to work together, which is something that we have been calling for in the previous time as well. But, you know, like the timing was not quite right? Because the former UN Special Envoy was outgoing while the ASEAN was still, you know, like struggling to appoint the Special Envoy. So the timing was not that right either. But now I think these two Special Envoys will have a chance to work together, and they should. And we expect them, we have a high expectation on them, yeah? So what they can do is that something that we have, you know, like tried to get our message out to them is to actually start holding the consultations. Again, coming back to the 5-point of the consensus, in order for the 5-point consensus to really implement, they need to start talking to everybody. We are not telling them not to talk to the junta, and they also should make sure that they talk to us. They talk to our government, the National Unity Government. I think that starting point alone is going to help, you know, like strategically to actually move way towards like more of this strategic collaboration for the implementation of the 5 points. That's what I would say. I think the UN Security Council must back up this joint efforts also. I think that's what I would say. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Khin Ohmar, for addressing the last question, and of course for adding more to what Ambassador has answered in relation to Multadar's question. Unfortunately, because of time restraints, we need to wrap up our Q&A session. We already have exceeded the time for this webinar, but don't worry. If you have any questions to our distinguished speakers today, you can comment it down on our Facebook Live video or on Twitter, and we will get back to you after the webinar. So once again, on behalf of FORUM-ASIA and CIVICUS, we would like to thank you for your participation in this webinar. We hope that you gain additional knowledge and valuable insights from our distinguished speakers today in relation to the Myanmar crisis, the assessment of Brunei's chairpersonship, and prospects for Cambodia's chairpersonship of ASEAN next year. For any queries or concerns regarding this webinar or regarding the topic, you can reach out to FORUM-ASIA and CIVICUS via Facebook, Twitter, and email. Thank you, everyone. And on behalf of FORUM-ASIA and CIVICUS, once again, we wish you the happiest of holidays, advance Merry Christmas, and Happy New Year to everyone. We wish you safe and peaceful holidays this year. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.